Welcome to the second day of our conference. Also on behalf of Sehun, it's very nice to see you again. First one we'll present is our colleague, Professor Francis Macatangay. You have a very difficult family name to pronounce, so I'm not sure I did it the right way. Please correct me. We are very pleased that you're with us. And you will say something about the book of Tobit. Your presentation is entitled Tobit as a reader of Isaiah 40 to 66, as especially reflected in his hymn in Tobit chapter 13. So the floor is yours, so welcome.
Thank you, and good morning to each and every one of you once again, or good day, good evening. Yes, that is indeed the title, and you did pronounce my name correctly, so no need to worry on that. The title of the paper is rather long, and as I continue to look into this, I decided it's probably be best to simply entitle this paper as Tobit as Reader of Isaiah. And so as many of you know, the book of Tobit weaves many biblical and non-biblical threads in the crafting or in the spinning of its story. And one of those threads is the prophetic texts. For instance, in an episode describing Tobit's grief after leaving his Pentecost meal to bury the body of a dead kinsman, the narrative includes a direct quote from the prophet Amos. Eating his food in sorrow over what should have been a joyful celebration, he remembered the prophecy of Amos in chapter 8, verse 2. Your festivals shall be turned into mourning, and all your songs into lamentation. In another instance, close to the end of the narrative, Tobit invokes the prophecy of Nahum, or in some manuscripts, Jonah, against Assyria and Nineveh to get his son Tobias to hurry off to Media for safety, claiming, and I quote, that everything that was spoken by the prophets of Israel, whom God sent, will occur, and none of all their words will fail. End of quote in Tobit 14:4. Now, in the case of Tobit's hymn of praise in Tobit 13, the Tobit writes or composes, at least according to the long Greek version. And this is something he composes or writes in response to the angel's command to bless God and to acknowledge and declare God's marvelous deeds. No prophet is actually identified, and no prophetic text is directly cited or quoted. It is often observed, however, that Tobit 13 echoes and alludes to specific texts, especially to Isaiah 40 all the way to 66. For instance, it is claimed that Tobit 13:11 alludes to Isaiah 61 to 14, and Tobit 13:16 to 18, that section about Jerusalem and its gates covered with all kinds of precious stones, the city of Jerusalem, that it alludes to Isaiah 54:11 to 12. And perhaps, you know, the theme, not perhaps, I have another thing here, but finally, the theme of many nations bearing gifts in their hands as they come to Jerusalem is, of course, a theme that is found in Isaiah chapter 2 and quite repeatedly in various mutations in Isaiah 55 to 66. Of course, you know, these allusions indicate that Tobit was familiar with Isaiah, and the discernment of these allusions, however, does not really explain what I would call the relationship between Tobit 13 to 14 to the rest of the story. The question, of course, is why is so personal a story suddenly gives way to a story that has national import? One may also ask why, if Tobit was familiar with Isaiah, why is it that the author or the implied author did not allude or cite Isaiah in the rest of the narrative? So for a long time, it was thought that Tobit 13 and 14 were later insertions into the narrative to give the story a wider significance. But of course, the discovery of Qumran fragments with texts that correspond to Tobit 13 and 14 show that if these chapters were inserted later, they were likely inserted early in the transmission of Tobit. And even if we grant that some parts of Tobit 13 may have come from a liturgical hymn, for instance, what some people might say, the Zion songs, it is just as likely that Tobit 13 was part of the composition from the very start. So as it stands, the narrative of Tobit posits a correlation between the very personal story in the rest of the story and Tobit 13 and 14. One plausible way to make sense of the connection of Tobit 13 and 14 to the rest of the narrative was given by Stephen Weitzman, who argued that the allusion to the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32 is perhaps the logic for why these chapters conclude the narrative. I quote Weitzman, but we can leave that. But I would like to explore and argue that perhaps another plausible way to explain the presence of Tobit 13 and 14 in the narrative is by way of the book of the prophet Isaiah. What commentators may not have quite fully appreciated previously is the influence of the book of Isaiah, not only in the hymn that Tobit writes, but also in the narrative as a whole. After all, it can be argued that Tobit 13, the hymn, stands as pars pro toto, as resemblance, representing the whole book. The book of Tobit then may have been written, I suppose, and I would like to argue, partly in response to a reading of Isaiah. It is a composition that comes from a dialogue with a prophetic text, and this prophetic text is namely Isaiah. So in short, the book of Isaiah may have been, in the end, the scriptural prompt or for the composition of Tobit as a narrative, and it's a scriptural warrant for the truthfulness of its claims. Because Tobit 13 is so important in the narrative, and Tobit 14, and since it stands for the whole book, perhaps the allusions there are indicative of a far deeper influence of Isaiah, and that may have come from the reading of Isaiah, especially Isaiah 40-66. Now, what I would like to argue then for the last, or what I would like to explore are, I believe, four possible ways to show that, or four possible points. The hymn first is the hymn of Tobit. If we look at it very carefully, moves from the personal to the universal. It begins from his own experience of affliction and mercy, and then it moves to Israel's experience of affliction and mercy, and an exhortation to Israel to do what is right and what is true before God. And then it moves on to Jerusalem, also described as being afflicted, and there is the hope of Jerusalem experiencing mercy. And then it covers the mission of Jerusalem or the mission of the Israelites as a light to the nations, and that this bright light, Jerusalem attracts all the nations. And then, interestingly, it continues with the descriptions of Jerusalem as God's house that will be built for all the ages, and it echoes all those eschatological expectations. As Professor Sweeney covered yesterday, the rebuilding of a temple is really about the new creation. And so one could say that the text imminent reader of Isaiah finds this particular movement, or is given this particular movement that is in Isaiah 40 to 66, with the mention of the individual servant, and then of course its permutation to Israel, or possibility of being Israel. And of course, the text refers to the servant Jacob, Israel, and then to Jerusalem, daughter Zion, and then to the nations. And then and then of course it ends with the transformation of the world into a new heaven and a new earth, And so, as I said, this cosmic transformation is signified by the magnificent rebuilding of the eschatological temple in Tobit 13, as well as in Tobit 14. Perhaps, and I would like to explore really your thoughts about this one as well. The second point would be that there is, in Isaiah 40 to 66, a certain dynamic between the individual and Israel. There is, as God shows his gracious acts of forgiveness, reconciliation, and restoration in new, unexpected, and dynamic ways in Isaiah 40 to 66. There is this particular dynamic between an individual figure and Israel, and this is, of course, in the figure of the servant. And I would like to explore here the possibility of looking at the book of Tobit as filling in that mysterious persona of the servant in relation to the collective, in relation to Israel, because a number of descriptions of the servant in Isaiah 40 to 66 could easily fill, or could easily provide the template, I suppose, for the character of Tobit. It's as if Tobit dramatizes in his character the persona, or the portrait of the servant in Isaiah 40 to 66. And there is a particular relationship there between the figure as it relates to Israel. And in Tobit 13, that is also what seems to be happening. Tobit becomes a representative of that experience of God's healing, and he becomes a representative as well for Israel, or he stands for Israel. And then the third part that I would like to explore in this paper is the marriage metaphor, because, in Isaiah, there is a consistent image of marriage, unlike in some of the other prophetic texts. And this is taken up in the book of Tobit in the story of Sarah. And that marriage actually becomes a way of redemption, and perhaps, as one commentator has argued, could also look into the possibility of it being a remnant, and Tobias and Sarah producing children that will begin the new Israel, so to speak. And finally, there in the book of Isaiah, there is just something about the blindness and the ears, and deafness, in Isaiah chapter 6 and throughout. And so I would like to explore here the symbolic world of Isaiah, and somehow relate that to Tobit's blindness and healing, because of course his healing of his blindness can be considered as like a first sign, or a first installment of what God is about to do for Israel. So what Tobit has experienced in his blindness and his healing, God will now do for Israel, which is something that Isaiah speaks about, something that God will do. And then later on, Isaiah continues the prophecy with what God will do for Israel, and of course for the whole cosmos, for the whole creation. So those are the things that I would like to further explore in this paper, and I would like to open it, for your discussions, as well as for questions and what have you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Francis, for your very rich paper. I'm very honored to introduce our second speaker and presenter, Professor Jacob Stromberg. Your presentation has the title Isaiah 40 to 66 as the reader's retrospective of Isaiah 1 to 39. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Archibald and Semin, for the invitation to present and contribute to the volume. The book of Isaiah has had many readers. There were readers who helped produce the book, including possibly Isaiah himself. And there were readers for whom the book as such was first produced. Presumably, they lived at some point in time between the prayer over the ruins of the Jerusalem temple in chapters 63 through 64 and that further judgment described in chapters 65 through 66, a judgment located on the horizon of their own future. And finally, there have been many readers since all the way up to the present. Here, I'm interested in what we might say about how readers from the second group were to understand the book on its own terms. In particular, I'm interested in that answer to this question, which is presupposed by the structure of the book itself, as one instance of the native textual competencies resident in the broader literary culture for and by which it was created. In short, what kind of reading does the structure of this book presuppose? At stake, then, is an understanding of the book that is historically and culturally appropriate to its native poetics as a product of the broader literary output of ancient Israel and early Judaism. So how was the ancient reader supposed to understand the book on its own terms? Central to this line of inquiry is the problem of how one was to relate the two halves of the book. Most scholars agree that the book of Isaiah divides itself into two halves, chapters 1 through 39 and 40 through 66. The second half of the book presents the vision of Isaiah in a completely different mode than does the first half. In chapters 1 through 39, one finds several titles and narratives that are arranged chronologically in a sequence leading up to Hezekiah's confrontation with the Assyrians. This chronographic material explicitly relates the first 39 chapters to the prophet Isaiah. By means of this narrative thread, the reader is projected back into the days of Isaiah the prophet throughout chapters 1 through 39. At the very beginning of this sequence of chronological references is the book's title in 1:1. Since this title defines the entire historical scope of the prophet's ministry as spanning the years from Uzziah to Hezekiah, it is almost certainly deliberate that immediately after the narratives concerning Hezekiah, all such references to the prophet disappear from the book. The second half of the book contains no titles or narratives of the sort that one finds in the first half. No explicit attempt is made to locate the voices of chapters 40 through 66 within the period of the narrative account of Isaiah's ministry given in chapters 1 through 39. Instead, one encounters a striking temporal dislocation built into the self-presentation of the second half of the book, differentiating the way it presents the vision of Isaiah from that in the first half. By design, the oracles in chapters 40 through 66 require the reader to accept that they speak not to Isaiah's contemporaries, but rather to a period after the prophet himself had passed from the scene. By contrast, the oracles in chapters 1 through 39 never appear to place this requirement on the reader. Instead, these oracles speak as if to those present in the days of the prophet. While this temporal shift has played a central role in developing models for the history of the book's formation, that whole line of inquiry cannot be substituted for the problem of structure as I'm thinking about it here. Structure in this sense addresses a different issue. From the point of view of those who gave the book its final shape, how were the ancient readers supposed to encounter such a break and coordinate the two halves of the book? Put another way, how was one to coordinate the vision, life, and times of the prophet in the first half of the book with that addressed to a latter-day audience in the second half of the book? How was the reader to relate the past of chapters 1 through 39 to that future in chapters 40 through 66? So in what follows, I briefly summarize two complementary strategies whose purpose was to enable the reader to coordinate the two halves of the book in a way that unlocks the logic of their temporal relationship. And both of these I've discussed elsewhere at more length than what I'm able to do here. So first, the narrative material in chapters 1 through 39 has been given a prospective function. And second, the first half of the book has been made an analogy in some respects for the second half of the book. In this way, the past has been made an analogy for the future in Isaiah. So first, the narrative material in chapters 1 through 39 bears a prospective significance for days beyond the prophet himself. In part, this is achieved by means of a series of comparisons and contrasts between Ahaz and his son Hezekiah. What the Ahaz and Hezekiah narratives work in tandem to demonstrate is the predictability of Israel's omnipotent God in working out his commitments to David. As the prophet proclaimed to Ahaz, God would honor his covenant in the face of threat when the Davidic king turned to him in trust, but disbelief put the royal house in jeopardy. The analogical rhythm of this narrative structure gives it a prospective function. Just as God honored the Davidic covenant during the Assyrian crisis, so also will he do so during the Babylonian crisis to come, provided the necessary conditions illustrated by Hezekiah's response to the Assyrians are met. Conversely, the sin of Hezekiah, which brought the Babylonian threat, would be no more of an impediment to a future fulfillment of this covenant than was that of Ahaz, which brought the Assyrian threat. In this light, it cannot be a coincidence that immediately following the Babylonian, or that Hezekiah account, comes the second half of the book, which addresses those living in the wake of Babylonian destruction. This half of the book exhorts Israel, fear not, al-tirah, the message given Ahaz and Hezekiah, and it offers Jerusalem a renewal of the Davidic covenant. But, as in the days of these kings, a disobedient response would lead to a further pronouncement of judgment, something which, after further accusations of recalcitrance in 58 through 59 and 65, the latter half of the book concludes. In 65 through 66, you have this future judgment that's coming on Judah. In line with the prospective significance of the narratives, the second strategy was to make the first half of the book an analogy for the second half of the book. This whole narrative structure in Isaiah 1 through 39 has been assigned a critical role for understanding chapters 40 through 66 on the principle that the past portends the future, or to put it the other way around, that the future will be analogous to the past. Such a principle explains not only elements of the structuring of chapters 1 through 39 by means of these narratives, which I just mentioned, but also the placement of the second half of the book on analogy to the first half. And here I can only mention a few items. The second half of the book begins in chapter 40 with an evocation of Isaiah's commission in chapter 6, and this is very widely recognized and has been for a long time. In chapter 6, God the King appears in glory and judgment. In view of this, there is a commission involving a kol koreh and a kol omer for judgment, so that the eyes and ears of the people will not see or hear, leading to a lack of understanding. In chapter 40, God the King will appear in glory and deliverance. In view of this, there is a commission involving a kol koreh and a kol omer again, for deliverance that the eyes and ears of the people will see and hear, leading to understanding. This suggests that what follows chapter 40 in the latter half of the book will be compared to the first half of the book, which portrays the prophet's message and ministry. It is hardly surprising then to note that chapters 40 through 66 conclude by means of a series of comparisons to the ending of chapters 1 through 39. Just before the account of the Assyrian attack on Judah, chapter 34 pronounces judgment on Edom, followed in chapter 35 by an assurance of Zion's restoration. Likewise, just before the prophecy of a future attack on Judah, chapters 60 through 62 assure the restoration of Zion in the language of chapter 35, followed in chapter 63 by an assurance of judgment on Edom in the language of chapter 34. So in the latter case, the two items are inverted. As this sequence leads one to expect, the next and final item within chapters 40 through 66 has been set on analogy to the next and final item within chapters 1 through 39. Chapters 65 through 66 give an account of an eschatological judgment on Judah, wherein a remnant is spared, precisely the scenario in chapters 36 to 38, with the important difference that this is a narrative account of the Assyrian destruction which came to pass in the days of the prophet himself. In both cases, the remnant is compared to grapes of a vineyard. In both cases, it is spared on account of my servants or servants, so that the attempt to destroy the whole is stopped. In both cases, this is God's response to a prayer regarding his zeal, Hinah. And in both cases, God acts in deliverance to spread the knowledge of himself among the nations, leaving the enemies as pegarim, corpses. So to sum up, the first half of Isaiah has been given a narrative structure that recounts the commission of the prophet and culminates with the story of Hezekiah. On the principle that the past portends the future, this narrative sequence, together with the oracles framed by it, has been made the key to understanding that future foreseen in the second half of the book. Accordingly, the second half of Isaiah begins immediately after the Hezekiah narrative with a reference back to the prophet's commission, rebooting the whole earlier sequence for the sake of the ancient reader's encounter with what follows it in the latter half of the book. This analogical patterning of the two halves of the book is fully complemented by the prospective function of the narratives themselves in chapters 1 through 39. 11 minutes, so it's a minute over.
I've noticed that was
Yeah.
11 minutes, but I do not mind.
Yeah.
It was very inspiring to listen to your presentation. Thank you so much. We come to our next presenter. I would like to introduce Professor Sue Kim Sweeney. And the title of your presentation is Storytellers at the Threshold, a metaleptic reading of Isaiah 30, verse 1 to 40, verse 11. The floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, I will share the screen. Okay, now can you see? Can you see
Yes,
that? Okay.
yes, we can see. Yes.
All right. Let's see. I can see. Okay, I will move this. And okay, yeah, thank you so much. So here, okay, despite many scholarly suggestions to fill the gaps in the text, reading Isaiah 39 and 40 with cogent logic is still challenging. In chapter 39, we encounter Isaiah's poor logic and inappropriate application of metaphor when the prophet used Hezekiah's action for the cause of a Babylonian exile. King's self-centered or enigmatic comment does not help us either. The situation of chapter 40 is not so different that the covert narrator is never generous to identify speakers and addresses. In between, there must be an invisible division marker once scholars recognized and now becomes a form tradition, so-called the end of first Isaiah and the beginning of second Isaiah. Although that division has explained the reason of abysmal gap between the two chapters, it is still questionable that whether this diachronic diagonals can satisfy our desires who want a holistic understanding to move on to the new era. So this study aims to present the last and first units of Isaiah 39 and 40 in a more sensible, acceptable, or even usable way to my contemporary readers. In terms of pragmatics, Isaiah 39, 1 to 40, 11 encourages us to maximize readers' role in building a better communicable context by managing gaps between the implied author's illocutionary intentions and the implied reader's perlocutionary reactions. As a self-directed reader, I will examine the syntactic and semantic structures of the text with the rhetorical nuances to set up my exegetical scope. Theoretically, any reader can claim unlimited ways to fill the gaps, but I myself limit to stay in the text syntactic and semantic scopes. So narrator, storyteller, As you noticed at the title, I identify myself as a storyteller. Narrator is more in the silent individual reading context, so less room to modify in the reconstruction. But storyteller is in the situation of the loud public and community performative context. So preachers can belong to this category. Then my title says metaleptic reading. What is that, right? Gerard Jennett defines that as any character or narrators cross over the designated level of the narrative. And I set up two kinds of metaleptic reading here. One is authorial, that metaleptic is in the text that author already planted, so reader just recognize it. And the other one is readerial, that reader makes it in filling the various gaps. And that metaleptic reading is a platform for the reader's self-involved dialogues. And so transtemporal, spatial characters, narrative borderlines can happen in the reader's mental space. And actually, I wish to explain my structure analysis, but because of the time, I just attach it to the handout. So just one thing I want to mention here is who speaks and who. So I say here, we have at least 4 distinct characters and one very covert narrator. So that's a script line there. And here, stage or characters line, the first one is a speaker, which is voice here. And I saw, I read this one as a heavenly figure, not the divine, but divine messenger, who already internalized God's message. And he has more power than all 3 addresses. Now I distinguish 3 addresses here, 1, 2, 3, according to its gender and number. The first group is a mixed group as masculine plural, including number 2 and number 3 there. But the main task says address number 1 has more power, probably heavenly crew, than number 2 and number 3. And number 2, I read as a male human being, and number 3 as a female human being. And the verses to pay attention, I chose 3 verses here. One is then he said versus then I said in verse 6, and the grace is the people in verse 7. And the last statement of Hezekiah, there shall be peace and wellness in my days. So my intention is, not to choose which one is better option, for example, like in verse 6, but to provide plausible options to appreciate the process of a potential change of reader's self-involvement. So the first one, then he said versus then I said. The ancient and modern Bible verses also chose this one. And if you choose this one, that is a heterodeic narrator, introduces the character's direct speech. So that version, that option can keep the distance from the event, characters, and the reader. Meanwhile, if you choose then I said, that goes to homodeic narrator character, expresses as an eyewitness. Then, it is our character himself and his audience matter. So if you choose I said option, as you see here in all red I line here, I saw, I heard, and I heard the voices calling, I heard. Everything is wrapped in the personal eyewitness report. So that one is, we saw without much trouble, I can be identified in 3 different entities in the transformative metaleptic reading. One, I can be the narrator character who witnesses the heavenly council meeting and got the command to deliver the good news. And also it can be the storyteller performer when he or she speaks that line to the audience. I am now talking, right? And then it can be also easily to transform to the storyteller's audience who is about to involve in this reading. As an implied storyteller, I would lead my implied audience, the community, to transform themselves to the first person eyewitness. So when the divine invitation becomes ours, then the problem is unsolved tension during the exile grows high. So now the second one, indeed, the grace is the people. That line can be authorial and rhetorical metalepsis. So I say, whose line is this? Can we determine whose line? And I say, yes. The grammatical scope that I set up allows the flexibility. So I want to assign then this line as to the metaleptic narrator and eventually the metaleptic storyteller. I am the metaleptic storyteller right now. So that reading can even make possible that the narrator interrupt the voice's speech. So metaleptic storyteller takes this clause as her aside line and challenge it to the voice, the author, and also God. At the same time, by moving it to the storyteller, she challenges her audience who is not ready to challenge it to the divine proposal. So how it is possible? Because Isaiah 41-11 often omit to indicate the change of the speakers. And by doing so, actually, it makes possible to avoid awkward repetition due to the 4 times of people's aggress notion in one speaker's speech. That's why Septuagint omits that line, I think. And it makes more live debate among voice, address number 2, the narrator and the storyteller. So again, the tension between the ontological and teleological views grow. So if I say, what is the question about that is what the divine invitation means to us after chapter 39. If our God is the ultimate cause to make us suffer such a long time. So here is the situation here as I gave it to as a handout. So voice says, proclaim, then address says, how can I proclaim? All flesh is grass. And then here, one possible is a metaleptic narrator intrude and aside to his implied audience and says, surely the grass is the people. Then the voice replies, no. The grass withered, the flower faded, but the word of God shall stand forever. And here is the logical flow according to my structure analysis. And you see here the dark area, God commanded to the voice. We assume that happened, behind the stage. And then on the stage or the text here, voice to address, this is a command scene. And we see the divine command form. And then I see verses 6-8 as a discussion, unexpected discussion or debate by address 2. And then voice resumed his command 2, now voice to address number 3, the female, urged to take connection by introducing Yahweh's character in more detail. So now here we see narrative pause. The author intends to persuade
May
his
I
audience.
ask you to come to a conclusion, please?
Yeah, okay, sure. The author intends to persuade his audience to believe in God's word, but the metaleptic narrator or metaleptic storyteller resists. So here I say, narrative pause by rereading the Hezekiah's last statement. So I will skip this. And as Jacob presented here before, the has sequence and Hezekiah sequence and Zechariah's immediate audience sequence, we learn some kind of generational sequence. So the question is, what if I continually say that the people are grass and do not accept this proposal? Then what can be the consequence to my children? So this is the last scene. So after understanding Hezekiah's line as his desperation and agony, we recognize that the book of Isaiah might teach us to consider the generational sequence. So the realization provides the reason to accept God's proposal, although we resist, not just go on to the proposal. So we accept God's proposal, not because the divine voice is trustworthy at this time, but because we come out and situate ourselves onto the theological level too. So for the sake of our children's days. So we write Yahweh's name in our heart and call it hope. So our children, if not we, will see the glory of God. And Hatikva reminds us that as long as in the heart within the soul of a Jewish still yearns, our hope is not yet lost. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. It's always challenging to present a new way of reading a very well-known text. I'm very honored to introduce to you Professor Douglas Estes, and the title of his paper is John Reading Isaiah. The floor is yours, Douglas, please.
Thank you, Archibald and Seun, for inviting me, and good morning from Kansas. And so I'm looking forward to spending a couple of minutes here to share. I think I just shared my screen, and hopefully you all can see. Right now, the title of my paper, since Archibald and I last talked, is Isaiah's Glory in John's Gospel. And I don't have a subtitle yet, so my joking subtitle is Yet Another Ambiguity for the Implied Reader in John. But that's not, that's just a joke for us today, not not the official. But anyway, we're going to look at this issue of how John reads Isaiah's glory. So, there we go. So to start with, I've been intrigued as I've been working in John with the semantics of the concept of glory. As we all know, glory is an important concept in the ancient world, but it was not one that was always very easily defined. Lots of scholars have noted the problem of glory, and I'm even speaking from the New Testament side of things, that there's been quite a number of studies about how this concept comes from the Old Testament into the New Testament. And I found that this problem existed even in the gospel writers' day, that there was some wide semantic range at times in the sense of glory. From my study so far, I feel that there is the dominant Hellenistic culture of the day understood glory in the Homeric way, as great deeds that outlasted death, and that if you were to walk up to a Helen in the 1st century AD and you were to talk about glory, that this would be the response that you might get from the majority culture. And then I find that there is a minority Hebraic culture of the day understood glory as the manifestation of the divine majesty, specifically in the Isaianic way. And although there's been quite a number of studies of the semantic spectrum of this concept, I find that, or at least at this point, I would say I'm pretty convinced that, again, for the average reader in the 1st century, that this is the two primary poles that they're being pulled towards. So either the dominant Hellenistic concept or the minority Hebraic concept. So again, not to discount all the great studies out there that break down the semantics of glory much further. I'm not sure that that breakdown would have been, like, it would have been understood intuitively by people, but I'm not sure that it would have been obvious to them, I think, in the same way that either a Homeric or an Isaianic view of glory would be. So that's my starting point. Now, when we talk about John and glory, John the Evangelist is aware, I believe, of both senses of glory, both Homeric and Hebraic. And again, Homeric, not because I'm arguing that John is reading Homer in the same way that he's reading Isaiah, but just because he's in the culture. It's the majority culture. He's heard stories. He's aware of things. He's heard people talk. So mixing it up with people in the 1st century. So John knows of the Homeric sense of glory from living in Greek culture. And so there are times in John where he speaks about glory from what I would consider, and of course, semantic range, we can debate, but he seems to be taking a very Greek sense that, it's just deeds. Are these the deeds? Are these, will these deeds last forever? But of course, we also know that John knows of the Hebraic sense of glory also from reading the Old Testament, and I would argue specifically Isaiah. And so there's some texts where, in the process of telling his story of Jesus, John is clearly referring in the sense of glory to an Old Testament or Hebraic sense. Now, here's, I guess you would say, the linchpin, one of the linchpins of my argument is that because of the way that John writes, John is well known for using ambiguity to create, two different ways, a polyvalent interpretation of ideas and concepts. And so because of John's desire to use ambiguity as a literary device, I'm arguing in this paper that John does that with glory as well, that he understands that there is a semantic ambiguity, a cultural ambiguity, and that he is able to exploit that for his reader. So what happens is that there are times, and let me pull up the text here. This is an example, but there are times where he seems to understand both and wants to pull on both. So, for example, in John 2:11, John writes, "This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory." Okay, so in the sense, when you get to the end of that statement, we have a strong Isaianic and Old Testament sense of glory, but he's still talking about it in relation to deeds, which is, it seems to me more of the Greek sense of this word. And so, is he creating an ambiguity for his readers between his reading of Isaiah and his reading of culture? Okay, so that's part of my argument there. So John and his real readers, John the Evangelist is aware that his real readers may not get his take on glory. So this is the second part of my argument, that just because John sees that there's an ambiguity there, he's not maybe convinced that all of his readers will get it. So John wrote in Greek within a fully Greek culture. I think, we agree with that, regardless of the authorship issues. The writer of the gospel wrote in Greek within a fully Greek culture. The second thing, though, and this I know is not the majority position, it's a minority position, it's my position, that John wrote his gospel for outsiders, not insiders. My studies, some of the monographs I've written over the years, that has caused me to shift my view away from the majority perspective that John was written for a small group of insiders. I argue that it was largely written for outsiders. Okay, so as a result of that view, I argue that John must provide clues to his Greek readers sometimes on Hebraic meaning and culture. For example, this idea of the word Messiah, Christ in John 1:41, or not just saying the Passover, but the Passover of the Jews. Now, scholars recognize that third point there, that John is providing clues. They don't always recognize it that it's clues for outsiders. They think it's clues for insiders. That's a long John debate. We won't get into it here. But here's the third, I guess, linchpin of my presentation in my paper is that there is one somewhat overlooked clue, is that John's definition of glory in John 1:14. So as I was thinking about John and reading this, it's well accepted in John studies that in John 1:14, I say well accepted, it's noted regularly in John studies that John writes, "And the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as the only Son and from the Father." So he doesn't just say, he could say, hypothetically, "And the word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, and we have seen his glory full of grace and truth." That would make logical sense, I think. But what happens is he says glory, and then he defines, or Joanne Brandt in her commentary says delineates what he means by glory. So glory as of the only Son from the Father. So I'm basically trying to build the case that John here is explaining or defining glory for his reader, so that the reader will know that John is not in this gospel primarily going to consider this idea of glory and Jesus's glory from a Homeric sense of great deeds, but is rather saying, hey, no, I'm defining it this way that you may not be familiar with. So he's saying not Homer, something else. So John and his implied readers. John the evangelist is pointing his readers away from Homer to Isaiah when it comes to glory. John's definition of glory is different than many readers, many of his real, well, let me say it this way. John's implied reader is not sure about what type of glory is going to be used here. Because again, the majority culture holds it this way, John's holding it this way. John wants the implied reader to know, listen, you may know Homer, you may know Greek culture, but now you need to go back and read Isaiah to understand what I'm going to talk about with glory. I'm not going to talk about glory from a deeds perspective. I'm going to talk about glory from a manifestation perspective. The implied reader must, as Archibald says, must do reading work. So John is telling his readers, you've got to go do some reading work here. John's goal for the implied reader is to be fully aware of Isaiah as well as the cultural stereotypes, so as to fully appreciate his attempts at ambiguity. And later, when he gets into more ambiguous uses and a play on the concept of glory, that the reader is fully aware because they've done the reading work in Isaiah before they've come to John. All right, so that's basically my argument. It's, the chapters are rather short, and so try to keep it right on target. Some unanswered questions. Maybe I have a minute or two left, I'm not sure, but some unanswered question remains. The challenge I've had so far is, where is John the evangelist pointing his readers to for glory in John? I mean in Isaiah. Is he pointing them to a specific section of Isaiah, or if he's just saying, listen, look at this whole concept? Secondly, ambiguity is a well-established Johannine device. What does this research add to the conversation there? And what more can we say about a real reader of Isaiah who has their own implied or real readers? Because of course the levels start really multiplying here. And how does that shape a general reading and reception of Isaiah? Okay, so I will end there, and hopefully not too early or too late.
No, you're perfectly on time. Thank you so much, Douglas, for your very stimulating paper. We are very happy that you, Professor Albert Hogeterp, will present to us your paper, Qumran, Reading Isaiah, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So let me share a screen. This one. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, so let me start. Qumran, Reading Isaiah. In their introduction to Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, Abeck, Flint, and Ulrich noted that the book of Isaiah is among the most prominently attested biblical texts at Qumran. It ranks only after the Psalms and Deuteronomy in its number of extant manuscripts. Unlike some other later prophets, such as Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the book of Isaiah is not surrounded by parabiblical cycles of text at Qumran. And yet, the corpus of Qumran literature has come down to us from a period of time, the late Second Temple period, when textual fluidity or plurality was part of the interpretive transmission of scriptural texts. What does this mean for our understanding of reader and reading in the case of Qumran reading Isaiah? Some observations should illustrate the complexity of the categories of readers and reading from the start. In their epilogue to the volume on ancient readers and their scriptures, Garrick Allen and John Anthony Dunn use an expanded definition of reading as compared to that of Wolfgang Iser, who took reading as the essential precondition for all processes of literary interpretation. Yet with a view to ancient readers, and their reading, Allen and Dunn refer to a broader web of other modes of textual engagement. They thereby take into account the reconstruction of ancient reading habits, processes of interpretation, copying, text collecting, and production, and above all, the ways in which ancient readers negotiated the physicalities of manuscript culture. This expanded definition of ancient processes of reading is also particularly important for our topic of Qumran reading Isaiah. That is, the corpus of Qumran literature comprises both biblical manuscripts of Isaiah and non-biblical texts which refer to the book of Isaiah in explicit and implicit ways. So on to types of reading Isaiah at Qumran. When turning to this corpus, we directly face the complexity of ancient reading processes. Since one can distinguish writing as reading in biblical manuscripts of Isaiah from interpreting as reading among non-biblical Qumran texts that quote or allude to Isaiah. So writing as reading. Starting with the Qumran biblical scrolls, the evidence at hand ranges from the large Isaiah scroll, 1Q Isaiah A, which counts 54 columns, to 1Q Isaiah B with 28 columns, and various fragments of 18 Isaiah manuscripts from Qumran K4. Even though scholars are agreed that no variant editions existed of the book of Isaiah, the evidence rather pointing to a single main edition, textual variants in the Qumran Isaiah scrolls do include evidence of literary and exegetical significance for the interpretive transmission of Isaiah. So first, something about textual history of pluses. Starting with the textual history of Isaiah, close comparison between Qumran Isaiah scrolls, the Masoretic text, and the Septuagint has led to the identification of various verses as secondary accretions of text. Examples are on the slide of the PowerPoint. So let me mention a few examples. Isaiah 2 verses 9b to 10, present in other textual witnesses, are absent from 1Q Isaiah A, whereby the topic of humankind being humbled and brought low naturally continues in this Isaiah scroll from Isaiah 2 verse 9a to Isaiah 2 verse 11. Another example may be Isaiah 38 verses 21 to 22, which agrees with 2 Kings 20 verses 7 to 8. These verses on Isaiah's instruction for the healing of King Hezekiah were reportedly added by secondary scribal hands in 1Q Isaiah A. One among several explanations could be that this possibly later accretion of verses is an example of inner biblical exegesis, where material from 2 Kings became incorporated in the book of Isaiah. Another feature are interpretive readings. In other cases, textual variants of a few words in Qumran Isaiah scrolls may illuminate exegetical choices in the process of interpretive transmission by scribes. Examples adduced by various scholars are on the slide of the PowerPoint. So from Blenkinsop, various examples from 1Q Isaiah A, and from Mizrahi, an article on Isaiah 24 verses 2, 7, and 15, from Isaiah scroll from numbered C from Qumran Cave 4. So onto interpreting as reading, genres of text. Next to writing as reading, the non-biblical Qumran texts illustrate various processes of interpreting as reading, which may be categorized along several literary genres. There are four major genres of non-biblical Qumran text in which the book of Isaiah figures prominently in explicit or implicit ways: exegetical texts, rule texts, eschatological texts, and poetic texts. It is beyond the scope of this short paper to turn to each of these texts in great detail, but I can make some general observations regarding types of interpretive use. The relevant texts regarding quotations and allusions are enumerated on the PowerPoint slide. In the Isaiah Pesherim, many passages of First Isaiah, in particular Isaiah 10 verse 20 to 11 verse 5, figure prominently in the interpretation of Isaiah's visitation, the return of a remnant, and the appearance of a messianic king as applied to the latter days, including the envisioned destruction of the Kittim in Israel's war against them. Yet the Isaiah Pesharim are not only concerned with Pesher-type exegesis of cited portions of the book of Isaiah. Occasionally, they also intersperse this with citations from the minor prophets, such as Zechariah 11 verse 11 and Hosea 6 verse 9. In the eschatological midrashim, quotations of Isaiah are recurrently combined with quotations from the Psalter. In one identifiable case, this concerns the matching topic of a benediction of people who stay clear from the counsel and path of the wicked. In Tanchumim from Qumran Cave 4, passages from 2nd Isaiah are quoted with a view to the overarching thematic concern of expected theodicy in terms of words of consolation, addressing Israel's election over against fears of abandonment. In Qumran rule texts, Isaiah further plays various roles. The Serach HaYachad applies the quotation of well-known words from Isaiah 40 verse 3 to prepare the way of the Lord in the wilderness to the incentive for members of the community to study Torah along with the prophets in a way segregated from the so-called people of sin. In the Damascus document, quotations from Isaiah are most recurrently related to the topic of trial, tribulation, and visitation of Israel as part of the text's admonition, but also as part of the laws. As part of the eschatological texts, Isaiah is quoted regarding a wide range of topics concerning both war and peace. Thus, peace and salvation are in view in the citation of Isaiah 52 verse 7 in 11q Melchizedek. But the idea of an appointed time for God's power against the Kittim surfaces in the quotation of Isaiah 31 verse 8 in the War Scroll. When we turn to poetic texts, such as the Hogeterp and the so-called Messianic Apocalypse of manuscript 521 from Qumran Cave 4, Isaiah is not quoted, but allusions to this prophetic book are interwoven in the poetic fabric of these texts. Examples of intertextuality with Isaiah are the communal self-designation as an everlasting plantation in Hogeterp, echoing Isaiah 60 verse 21, and the marvelous acts of the Lord, such as the acts of making the dead live and proclaiming the good news in 4Q 521, possibly echoing Isaiah 26 verse 19 and 61 verse 1. So, patterns of intertextuality with Isaiah. Turning to patterns of intertextuality with Isaiah in the non-biblical Qumran text, you find an overview of quoted parts of Isaiah on the PowerPoint slide. It appears that 1st Isaiah is most extensively quoted in the Pesharim. 2nd Isaiah is further cited in exegetical, rule, and eschatological texts, but what is sometimes called 3rd Isaiah is partially cited. But it is alluded to in various ways. So for time's sake, we now turn to some evaluation and conclusions. Quotations of Isaiah are variously introduced in Qumran non-biblical texts, including, for instance, designations such as the words of Isaiah, son of Amos, the prophet, to the book of Isaiah, and the word that is fulfilled or will come true. This also reveals something about the role of the reader, who interpreted Isaiah as the ongoing words applied to later times in actualizing an eschatological exegesis. The use of Isaiah at Qumran has been previously categorized by George Brooke in terms of genre and modes of discourse, such as legal, eschatological, poetic, and exhortatory use. Next to these overarching literary categories, the interpretive use of quotations of Isaiah may further be categorized in terms of the topics that are signified. In certain cases, signified topics may recur across genres and modes of discourse of Qumran non-biblical texts. Major examples of signified topics include the use of Isaiah as words of consolation, as a foundation charter for members of the community, as exhortation about otherworldly trials, divine visitation and punishment, as a message of peace and salvation, as foretold oracle of God's power to overthrow the rule of Kittim, as a benediction of those who turn away from wickedness. The interpretive use of allusions to Isaiah may be part of the invocation of the Lord's marvelous acts in the so-called Messianic Apocalypse, or of communal self-designations in the Hogeterp. So finally, let me very briefly point out something about Qumran reading Isaiah among other ancient reading communities. The field in which Qumran reading Isaiah may be situated is huge, and some observations on comparison with other ancient reading communities can only be tentative here. A first example can be other Second Temple literature. Explicit examples include for Maccabees, where citation of Isaiah 43 verse 2 is part of martyrological exhortations from the law and the prophets, and the Psalms of Solomon, which alludes to Isaianic imagery, which reportedly also intersects with Qumran literature. Another example of an ancient reading community is the Pharisaic rabbinic tradition. An example of comparison.
Hou je een beetje de tijd in de gaten.
Ja,
je zit al op 13 minuten, hè?
Okay, sure, I will briefly summarize. An example of comparison could be echoes from Isaiah and liturgical texts following Torah reading. For instance, the words of the luminaries comprises various echoes of Isaiah and has been compared with the Amidah regarding shared type of prayer practice and language. And finally, early Christianity. Prominent examples of comparison include quotes from Isaiah 40 verse 3, prepare the way into the wilderness, and from Isaiah 61 verse 1 to 2 on good news to the poor. So these are my brief observations. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you for your very detailed and interesting presentation. Then I think we can conclude our two-day conference. I would like to thank all our presenters for the very interesting and challenging papers. Also on behalf of Sehun. I've learned a lot of all these presentations. I'm very grateful for that. If I have class online, I always struggle with the time we have for discussion because hardly anyone is willing to say something, but there was no problem during our conference at all. And if the conference were in person, we would have time to continue our discussion during a dinner. So who knows, we will have the opportunity to continue our discussion in person with a nice dinner sometime in the future. You never know, but I'm very happy that it was also able to meet each other online. We are looking forward to your contributions to our volume. So once again, thank you so much. All the best and bye-bye. Hope to see you next time. God bless.